As the threats of war intensify between Russia and Ukraine, the U.S., a nation at the forefront of technological advancement, has imposed a swath of fresh sanctions on Russian oil and gas, which could cost the country billions of dollars per month. Although the current U.S. President, Donald Trump, is an important tool in negotiations to end the war, with more aggressive sanctions and energy policy, how is the new U.S. administration willing to exert that pressure? And is Trump too keen on pursuing a friendship with Russia as a way of isolating China? Join us as we uncover how the U.S. just meltdowns Russia's main export income. Trump warned Russia for the last time. Get out. Currently, Russia's war economy is expanding at a breakneck pace, far outpacing the country's natural growth potential. Driven initially by a tremendous spike in defense expenditure, to an extent coupled with a very considered policy to protect ordinary citizens of Russia from all economic downsides of this war. That translates into an amazing 43% of direct defense and internal security spending under the draft 2025 budget. But more than the military allocations, the Kremlin is bolstering the war economy. The Kremlin has increased public spending in other fields, such as pensions and state-funded infrastructure projects, by a lot, thus pouring even more money into the economy. At the same time, state-backed lending programs have flooded businesses and households with cheap credit, further fueling economic activity. But this economic boom is being dashed by an increasingly serious labor shortage. Since 2022, Vladimir Putin has added nearly 500,000 soldiers to the war effort, depleting the civilian workforce. At the same time, a mass exodus of young, skilled professionals has drained the country of vital human capital. These factors and long-term demographic shifts that are steadily shrinking Russia's labor force have created an acute labor supply crisis. This has led to an overheated job market, with demand far outstripping supply. That has sent wage growth into unsustainable levels, with salaries rising by nearly 20% for most of last year, a pace not seen in 15 years. Such wage inflation is a direct threat to the central bank's 4% inflation target, and as such, price stability becomes ever more elusive. In Putin's view, inflation is a political and not merely an economic issue. High prices, according to him, threaten his power, so he gave much space to the governor of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, to harden the policy of the monetary authorities. Under her, the central bank has adopted a series of tough steps, like hikes in interest rates and others, aimed at cooling an overheated economy. However, with Russia's war-driven economy running on artificial stimulus and labor constraints intensifying, the long-term sustainability of this model is anything but certain. The U.S. recently added another considerable stressor of sanctions and energy due to the effects of its war in Ukraine. Anyway, what actually led to these sanctions from the U.S.? War broke out between Russia and Ukraine in February 2014, developing into the most extensive European conflict since World War II, reconfiguring global geopolitics and causing a long-standing humanitarian crisis. What initially started as local strife in the Crimea and Donbas regions of Ukraine has since erupted into a full-scale war involving Russia's invasion that began in 2022. Making it Europe's largest military confrontation in decades. The war has caused tens of thousands of deaths, widespread destruction, and the displacement of millions of people. Its original roots lie with the Euromaidan protests of late 2013 and early 2014, when a mass movement in Ukraine demanded closer ties with Europe and an end to corruption. This latter element resulted in what is known as the Revolution of Dignity, by which Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted from power. This was followed after his removal as Ukraine experienced wide-scale pro-Russian unrest, especially throughout its eastern and southern regions. Seizing the moment, unmarked Russian troops quickly occupied Crimea, and within weeks, Moscow annexed the peninsula following a controversial and widely discredited referendum. Meanwhile, in April 2014, Russian-backed separatists launched an armed uprising in Donbass, seizing control of key cities and declaring the formation of the Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, and Luhansk People's Republic, LPR. Although Moscow denies any direct involvement, it covertly funneled troops, tanks, and artillery into the region to bolster the separatists and keep Ukraine from reclaiming control. The Donbas fighting had settled into a long and bloody standoff, punctuated by repeated but ineffective ceasefires, including the Minsk II agreements signed in 2015. The war had dragged on for years of fits and starts, with offensives that neither side was able to make significant territorial gains, grinding down into a violent stalemate. By 2021, Russia had begun an unprecedented military buildup along Ukraine's borders in western Russia and occupied Crimea and Belarus. Yet even as Russian officials denied allegations of an impending invasion, President Vladimir Putin openly called into question Ukraine's sovereignty, claiming the country had no right to exist as an independent state. Among his demands was a guarantee that Ukraine never joined NATO, a condition the West categorically rejected. In early 2022, Russia took a provocative step by officially recognizing the DPR and LPR as independent states. On February 24, 2022, Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation, claiming it was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, an explanation that many consider propaganda. Within hours, Russian forces invaded Ukraine from several directions, launching airstrikes and ground assaults on Kiev, Kharkiv, and other major cities. The invasion has brought international condemnation, with crippling sanctions imposed on Russia by countries across Europe, North America, and beyond. Western nations have been racing to supply Ukraine with both military and humanitarian aid, strengthening its ability to resist Moscow's advance. After initial Russian successes, Ukraine resisted fiercely, and by early April 2022, Moscow had to drop its effort to take Kiev. Later in the course of the war, Ukrainian forces successfully launched counteroffensives, mostly in the northeast and south, liberating large parts of Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts by the end of the year. In response, Russia increased missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, such as power grids, railways, and civilian areas far from the front lines. In September 2022, Russia announced the annexation of the 4 partially occupied Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, contrary to an international rejection that such actions were illegal and illegitimate. Through 2023 and 2024, the war settled into a grinding war of attrition, where both the Russian offensives and Ukrainian counterattacks yielded only marginal territorial gains. Meanwhile, Ukrainian-backed cross-border attacks into Russia, such as the August 2024 offensive in Kursk Oblast, signaled an expanding scope of the conflict. Russia has been accused for long of intentional and indiscriminate attacks on civilians in which missile strikes have ravaged residential areas, schools, and hospitals. Then the International Criminal Court responded, launching an investigation into war crimes, and finally issued arrest warrants against Putin and a few other high-ranking Russian officials over the alleged deportation of Ukrainian children and targeting of civilians. Anyway, did it yield any results or have an effect on Russia in any way? Since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia's economy has performed better than many observers expected. The situation is hardly thriving, but the economic figures are far from catastrophic. Last year, for example, Russia's war economy likely outpaced that of the United States and major European countries in terms of growth. Unemployment is at an all-time low, and while the defense budget has surged, squeezing other sectors, this imbalance is seen as temporary. This relative, somewhat unexpected stability of the economy serves as a message from the Kremlin to both domestic and international audiences. The development made Elena Rybakova, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, put the message to the Russian public clear: we're still standing. The message to Ukraine's allies seems to be, we can outlast you. The Kremlin seeks to project an image of economic resilience, demonstrating to the world that it can outlast its adversaries in this suffering marathon. However, this economic optimism has some in the West questioning how effective such sanctions really are. Russia has continued to struggle under the measures, which were enacted first when Ukraine's supporters hit them, with many asking if the sanctions are really taking effect. In fact, President Putin himself belittled these sanctions by labeling them as logistical hurdles. If such sanctions aren't really affecting Russia's economy, some ask why they should be constantly applied. Some experts don't share this view. Many believe that the picture of Russia's economic resilience is an elaborate facade to convince foreign adversaries, and even the Russian public, that the country's economy is stronger than it really is. As the war reaches its third year, cracks are starting to appear in that narrative. With time, the long-term strain of the war on Russia's resources began to tell, and the economic mask that had been so painstakingly maintained started to slip, exposing vulnerabilities in Russia's ability to sustain a war economy. Nonetheless, with the new development, what measures in the form of sanctions have the U.S. put in place against Russia? The Joe Biden administration rolled out the most sweeping package of sanctions to date in December 2024 to significantly ratchet down Russia's oil and gas revenues, the main financial underpinning for its war effort. The move was designed not only to weaken Moscow's ability to sustain its military operations in Ukraine, but also to give Kyiv and the new administration of Donald Trump greater leverage in any future peace talks. The measures were designed to directly target Russia's energy sector, which has been the Kremlin's main source of income throughout history. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine since February 2022 has killed and wounded tens of thousands as large areas lay in rubble. The move is aimed at curtailing revenues Russia would collect from the sale of crude, in other words, hastening the end of the war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the sanctions as a major blow to Moscow's capacity to fund its war effort. Writing on X, he said the moves would, very significantly, weaken Russia's war economy, suggesting that a curtailment of its oil revenues would bring peace closer. His comments mirrored Ukraine's position that economic pressure is one of the most important instruments for forcing Russia to dial down its aggression. At the same time, during a briefing directed by the senior economic and national security advisor to the White House, Dalip Singh, citing the magnitude of such sanctions in effect, noted they're the most aggressive to have been levied against Russia's energy industry yet. He mentioned that this would also mean that the revenue from energy production would be at par with Putin's means of paying for his military. But is energy the only sweeping measure against Russia, or does it include its oil industry? Let's see. The latest round of U.S. Treasury sanctions was reported to have directly targeted some of Russia's biggest and most important energy firms, including Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas, which were heavily involved in oil exploration, production, and sales. Washington also reportedly blacklisted 183 vessels said to have been used to transport Russian crude oil, many of them supposedly forming part of a covert shadow fleet, made up of aging tankers operated by companies not based in the West. The vessels were believed to have played a critical role in helping Moscow evade earlier sanctions by transporting discounted Russian oil to major buyers in India and China. The change in trade flows followed the Group of Seven, G7, nations' 2022 price cap, which had largely cut Russia off from European markets. Some reports said several tankers had also been involved in shipping both Russian and Iranian crude, further complicating enforcement of restrictions. Among the most significant provisions in this sanction package was the removal of a critical exemption that previously allowed financial institutions to facilitate energy-related transactions with Russian banks. According to Washington, closing that loophole made it substantially more difficult for Russia to conduct oil sales and access its revenues through the global financial system. Additionally, one senior U.S. official briefing reporters on the sanctions suggested that properly enforced, the measures could cost Russia billions of dollars a month. According to him, no aspect of Russia's oil production and distribution system had been left untouched by the sanctions, making it ever more difficult for Moscow to evade them. They were quoted as saying that every step in the production and distribution chain had been affected, strengthening Washington's confidence that attempts to evade the sanctions would become even more expensive for Russia. Still, even with these blanket prohibitions, Gazprom Neft was said to have rejected the sanctions as unwarranted and illegitimate, asserting that it would carry on its business. Moscow had repeatedly insisted that Western sanctions were unsuccessful, hinting that Russia could fall back on other trade routes and financial mechanisms to keep its oil exports moving. However, with Washington now applying pressure in so many spots within Russia's energy sector, the long-term success of such efforts at evasion was far from guaranteed. As Ukraine looked into a fourth year of conflict, analysts suggested the effects of those sanctions could prove a significant factor in shaping both the military and diplomatic landscape of the war. Moreover, the newly announced sanctions also included a provision allowing sanctioned entities a wind-down period until March 12, 2025, to give them time to conclude any ongoing energy-related transactions. Sources within the Russian oil trade and Indian refining sectors, though, said the sanctions were expected to significantly disrupt Russia's crude exports to its key buyers, India and China. But will the sanctions in any way affect the U.S., or does the U.S. believe oil supply constraints are no longer a concern? Ahead of the official announcement by the U.S. Treasury, global oil markets reacted sharply. Brent crude spiked more than 3% and approached $80 a barrel after a document outlining the sanctions started circulating among traders in Europe and Asia. In a report, Jeffrey Pyatt, U.S. Assistant Secretary for Energy Resources at the State Department, hinted that the global oil market had grown more resilient since introducing price cap mechanisms. He said new oil production coming online in 2025, including from the U.S., Guyana, Canada, Brazil, and potentially from the Middle East, would make up for any supply shortfalls caused by reduced Russian exports. Pyatt was quoted as saying that the U.S. no longer considered itself constrained by tight global oil supplies in the same way it had been when the price cap was first introduced. The sanctions were part of a broader U.S. campaign to weaken Russia's war economy. Since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Biden administration has committed $64 billion in military aid to Kyiv, including a recent $500 million package dedicated to air defense missiles and support equipment for fighter jets. The latest measures came after a previous round of U.S. sanctions in November that hit key Russian financial institutions, including Gazprom Bank, Russia's main banking channel for international energy deals. The Biden administration had also earlier sanctioned dozens of oil tankers carrying Russian crude in an attempt to hobble Moscow's alternative trade networks. Also, the U.S. officials said the November sanctions had already put considerable strain on the Russian economy, contributing to the ruble's decline to its weakest point since the beginning of the war. The pressure, it was said, also forced Russia's central bank to raise its benchmark interest rate to a record high above 20% in an attempt to stabilize the currency and bring down inflation. One senior official said the newly imposed restrictions on the energy sector would further deteriorate these economic difficulties. He said the sanctions were expected to raise inflationary pressures, having already pushed Russia's inflation rate close to 10%, and setting a grim economic outlook for 2025 and beyond in motion. But is there any hope of reversal by the U.S. government? A senior Biden administration official said the decision to lift sanctions imposed during Biden's time would lie solely with President-elect Donald Trump, who will be sworn in on January 20, 2025. But it wouldn't be as simple as a mere executive action. Any attempt to roll back the measures would involve formal notification to Congress, which could then have the power to vote on a resolution of disapproval. The official added that many Republican lawmakers had previously urged President Joe Biden to impose the sanctions announced on Friday, suggesting that any attempt to reverse them might meet opposition within Trump's own party. Legal experts echoed that, with Jeremy Panner, a partner at Hughes Hubbard and Reed, emphasizing that Trump's team wouldn't be able to quietly lift the restrictions without Congress having a say in the decision. Trump's potential return to the White House has reignited talk of a possible diplomatic resolution to the war, with some hoping it could open the way for an end to Moscow's invasion. However, there is growing concern in Kyiv that a rush to peace under a Trump-led administration could come at a very high price for Ukraine. Some of Trump's advisors have reportedly floated proposals that would see Ukraine cede large portions of its territory to Russia, effectively legitimizing Moscow's territorial gains for the foreseeable future. Such a situation has raised fears that U.S. policy on Ukraine could shift dramatically, potentially weakening Kyiv's negotiating position. The Trump transition team has not issued a formal statement regarding the newly imposed sanctions. However, a Biden administration official said the military aid package and the energy sanctions rolled out over the past few months were intended to give the Trump administration more leverage in any future peace negotiations. The official said they represented a serious increase in both Ukraine's bargaining power and Washington's ability to broker a fair and lasting resolution to the war. As the war rages on, its long-term implications for global security, economics, and geopolitics remain uncertain. But with no end in sight, it is one of the 21st century's most consequential and destructive military confrontations. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel for more updates. While you're still here, make sure to click the video on your screen for more mind-blowing videos.